relate with people. He understood their struggles and their pains and their victories. And this is then an added dimension that we can bring to our understanding of Jesus.
It was here in Nazareth for 28 years where Jesus Christ would have lived. But it was in a carpenter shop with his father Joseph. The little boy would learn. And as Dr. Luke explains in his record of the life of Jesus Christ, this man, Jesus, would develop physically, mentally, socially, and spiritually. Key to that development is most likely his father Joseph. In a carpenter shop, something similar to this.
It was here, according to the Gospel writers, that Jesus, along with his brothers and sisters, were raised by their mother Mary and by his stepfather Joseph the carpenter. But it was only when Jesus began traveling, when he began his public life, that his reputation from Nazareth became a real issue. Who was this rabbi from Nazareth? Since we all know that there was a human side to him, this issue continues to the present. Is there any reason, as we look at the Jesus from history, to look for anything more than a man?
There are at least two reasons that modern scholars may be at times reluctant to consider the supernatural with respect to Jesus. One is that there are still some who believe that modern science has disproved any notion of the supernatural, and therefore, as modern enlightened people, we simply can't believe such stories. Increasingly, I think even more liberal scholars are recognizing that that's not true of modern science, but then they offer a second counter-argument, and that is that the ancient world is filled with myths and legends of people doing supernatural things, some with some parallel to the accounts of Jesus in the four Gospels, so that they believe that we should understand the original intentions of these stories to have been more mythological.
Why is it, though, that there is such division among scholars about where the search for Jesus is leading?
I think every person's study of Jesus with some set of assumptions, whether they be naturalist, supernaturalist, or whatever. I think that actually what the Bible sometimes calls upon us to do is to examine our assumptions. The Bible is a challenging book because sometimes it does challenge us. And it challenges us at the very point of the way we think the story should go. And what we find when we pick up the Bible is that when we read it, we find our assumptions sometimes are challenged.
One of the more sobering things to discover in studying the history of investigation into Jesus is that with very few exceptions throughout history, people, even who come with a very scholarly and objective approach to studying Jesus, tend to find what they already believed about him, or the philosophical or religious camps with which they already identified before ever coming to their more detailed research.
Some of them have actually probably come out of Christian homes growing up in their life and have rejected their Christian background and have rejected it pretty emotionally. And so it's an effort to tell the real truth about the way they grew up. I think others are sincere, and what I mean by that is that they're just naturalists, or a little more naturalistic in their approach, and so they don't accept what's in the text, and so then they work to try and explain how, one, we have the text the way it expresses itself, and two, what the next best and therefore most likely explanation is.
Must one believe in Jesus simply as a matter of personal choice and faith? Are those who look for the real Jesus on a scholarly basis destined to come away with more doubts than belief? How does a scholar or anyone come to the conclusion that the real Jesus is accurately reflected for us in the gospel records?
There are today many scholars, conservative scholars, who have given themselves over to the serious study of the historical Jesus, much as the moderates and liberals have. And many of them, well, the conservative ones, are coming to conclusions that are very much in line with what we see in the biblical record in terms of explaining who Jesus is.
It doesn't make sense to reject the record of the life of Christ just because it makes claims for the supernatural. First, because increasingly modern science recognizes that it can only speak about that which is predictable and repeatable. It cannot determine whether or not there is a God. And if there is a God who is the supernatural creator of the universe, then it makes sense that he could choose at times to supernaturally intervene into our world. If you're prepared to grant that premise, then the way to investigate any claim to the supernatural is to ask how strong the historical evidence is for it, just as you would any other kind of claim that somebody made of something that had happened.
Well, the reason we need to consider more than the humanity of Jesus, as objective scholarship sometimes asks us to do, or as the media sometimes asks us to do, is because you can't understand Jesus by just understanding his humanity. I tell students that the way in which the divinity and humanity of Jesus are woven together is a little bit like a molecule. And if you try and pull it apart, what you get is a big explosion. So they're just so intertwined and so tightly intertwined. Another reason why we can't do it is if we ask why Jesus is a significant figure to history, to Western civilization in general, it's not the claims of his humanness that make him important. It's the claims to his divinity and the fact that he gave birth to an international movement that claimed to be connected to God that was important about who he was. So it is his divine humanness together that makes the story. When you take out the divinity part of it, you've ruined the story, just like if you take out the humanity part of it, you ruin the story.
Objective scholarship in discussing any human figure from the ancient world has to take into account what that person said, what they did, what we can infer explicitly or implicitly about their own claims and self-identity or understanding of their own nature. And when one does that with Jesus, one finds innumerable data to suggest that he thought he was more than an ordinary mortal, that he saw himself as a divine emissary, a representative from God, using titles and language and behavior that, in the eyes of many of his Jewish contemporaries, crossed a boundary bordering on ascribing to himself prerogatives that were God's alone. Whether or not one accepts those claims, it is the responsibility of a historian to investigate them and to pass some kind of verdict on them.
The reason the discussion of the historical Jesus is important is because who Jesus claims to be. Jesus does not claim to be one great religious figure located next to a whole set of other great religious figures. If we built a hall of fame of religion, we wouldn't put several rooms in it and put Jesus next to Moses, next to Buddha, next to Confucius, next to Muhammad. Jesus' claim, the claim of the record is that he is unique, that if you build this hall of fame, you might have a wing that has all those people in it, but you better have a whole section of it that's uniquely dedicated to Jesus Christ. Someone who makes that kind of a great and unique claim needs to be taken seriously, because if he's right, we're accountable to him.
I was raised myself in a very liberal Protestant denomination. I was confirmed in that denomination. I can remember my pastor explaining to us in our confirmation class about all the irreconcilable contradictions in the Gospels. My actual faith in Christ as my Lord came, unfortunately, therefore, not through that particular church tradition, but through Youth for Christ ministry in my high school. And through that, and as I continued to be nurtured by various Christian organizations in my young adult years, came to be aware of the wide range of scholarly approaches to Jesus. I discovered that there was, in fact, very good scholarship to buttress the evangelical Christian view. I also discovered even more scholarly challenges than my pastor in my confirmation class had ever posed. And I was always a good student, a bit of an intellectual, someone who took very seriously the challenge of one college professor who once said very bluntly, "You cannot be a conservative Christian and retain your intellectual integrity." I wanted to investigate that to see if it was true, but I came to the conviction that it was not true.
I came to faith in college. I was not a believer growing up, and I had a belief that Jesus was a great religious teacher who was one among many. Someone handed me a Bible, said, "Read it. We think you're a capable reader. You look to be an intelligent person, so just read it. Don't get hung up in the genealogies at the start. Don't ask me about those names. Just read the Bible, starting with Matthew, see the story of Jesus, and ask yourself this one question. Does Jesus leave the option that he's one among many, or does Jesus portray himself as unique?" I picked up the Bible, started reading in Matthew, skipped over the genealogy very quickly as I had been instructed, was very dutiful in that regard, and all of a sudden it became clear to me Jesus wasn't one among many, which had been my pre-understanding, my assumption. Jesus was claiming to be unique. I could read the record and see that. The person who built their house upon the rock was the person who listened to what Jesus had to offer, and the person who built their house upon the sand didn't pay attention to Jesus. He and his teaching became the issue. And all of a sudden I realized this book, which I had had a perception of as being one thing, actually was challenging me with quite a different message, and I was put in the position of having to take my assumptions seriously or letting them go. And it became clear the more and more I read that my assumptions about the Bible were wrong and needed adjustment. And in the process, I came to understand who Jesus really was.
Hey Jim, this is a pretty good point of view, huh? In Jerusalem?
Be careful, don't lean too far over there.
Look at that, you can see the top of the old wall where many people take a walk to circle the city.
Also from here you see the old city and the new city behind us.
And I hope our time together today has given you some fresh perspectives on what we're convinced is probably the most important subject that you could ever think about.
We've heard today from a number of people who are convinced that a search for the real Jesus will lead you to the Jesus described in the gospel accounts.
The search for Jesus is not just a matter of faith, because there's a real historical record that is there to assess. And one of the unique points of Christianity, and it shares this with Judaism, is its groundedness in history. It's there for everyone to see. Jesus went around and told his disciples as he was getting ready to face his death, "I'm going to be handed over, I'm going to be condemned, I'm going to die, in 3 days I'm going to rise up."
Then he took the 12 aside and said to them, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and all things that are written by the prophets concerning the Son of Man will be accomplished. For he will be delivered to the Gentiles, and will be mocked, and insulted, and spit upon. They will scourge him, and kill him, and the third day he will rise again." Luke chapter 18.
Now we realize that in your own personal search for Jesus, you may not be ready to form any conclusions. In fact, you may find yourself confused. Certain that this man was a part of history, certain that he was a man and a good man, but not ready to conclude that he was the Son of God, a miracle worker, the Messiah. Well, if that's the case, then I'd encourage you, make sure you've gone to the original eyewitness accounts. Go to the Gospels, read it for yourself. Don't just take our opinion, don't take anybody's opinion, but read those scriptures for yourself.
Where are you in your search for Jesus? We hope you've been challenged by today's presentation. This program is just one of 3 where we will further explore the issue of who Jesus is. If you would like to receive a video containing all 3 parts of our series titled Search for the Real Jesus,